So, over the past few weeks, I've been reading a number of recent books on the Trinity from the past 30 years and looking at the development in research and in theories and models of the Trinity and thought about how the Trinity might relate to how we live, the social doctrines of the Trinity, anti-social doctrines of the Trinity. And I've basically found that discussion of the doctrine of the Trinity, at least over the last 30 years, has focused around four fault lines. Those fault lines include how much we can deduce about the Trinity in and of itself from the economy of salvation. So, one, the economic immanent distinction. The second thing that has been the second fault line that's been debated is the distinction between Eastern Trinitarianism and Western Trinitarianism. This is particularly prominent in early Trinitarian theology of the period that I'm looking at. So, as I've said over and over again, people like Moltmann, Zizoulas, Gunton, Grenz, Lacugna, they've all been influenced by that rule of Rahner's. Well, no, that's something different. They've all been influenced by that paradigm that makes a distinction between Western and Eastern Trinitarian theology. Also quite popular among those theologians earlier on in that period that I'm looking at is a suspicion of substance metaphysics and the suspicion of grounding the unity of God in substance. That's partly because in that Eastern-Western split that they see, they're suspicious of the paradigm that they're using contrasts a Western kind of substance metaphysics with an Eastern kind of hypostatic or perichoretic unity. And so a lot of the time their emphasis on the Eastern approaches to the Trinity are or result in a suspicion of substance metaphysics. And then finally, that kind of suspicion of substance metaphysics leads to perichoretic accounts of the unity of the three persons. Now, all of those points are debatable. How much of the immanent Trinity is revealed in the economy of salvation? Sometimes I also have mentioned in a few of these videos the shortfalls and limited nature of that kind of language about economic Trinity and immanent Trinity. It's almost like we get confused as saying there are two different Trinities, but that clearly isn't the case. So there are some problems with language. In terms of East-West split, it's been noted that the thought along those lines has changed significantly over the last 30 years. That paradigm that's so precious to people putting forward social doctrines of the Trinity, especially early on in the period that I'm looking at, so 1980s, that East-West split has been challenged significantly and pretty much rejected. With that, there is less of a reason to be suspicious of substance metaphysics. But substance metaphysics on its own account isn't necessarily inherently implausible. William P. Alston showed that there's still a good deal to be said of substance metaphysics. I myself quite appreciate substance metaphysics as a way of making sense of the world, and generally flippant appeals to Kantian philosophical theology don't do anyone any favours either. And then in terms of perichoretic unity, perichoresis is clearly very important, and we owe a lot to those theologians that brought perichoresis to the fore in the 80s. But perichoresis in and of itself can't supply an adequate account of ontological unity, nor can it necessarily imply certain things about how we should live socially. Notably, on this idea is Karen Kilby's article on perichoresis and projection. So we've actually seen a whole bunch of kind of momentum put behind doctrines of the Trinity. Mid 20th century, you saw this resurgence as a result of the work of Karl Barth and his putting the doctrine of the Trinity kind of at the head of his theology as a result of his doctrine of revelation. We see with Rahner's rule this approach to the Trinity that wants to bring people back to the historical, the salvation history inherent in the doctrine of the Trinity, how we postulate certain things about who God is in himself from the economy of salvation. So, and then on the East-West split, views have totally changed. A suspicion of substance metaphysics doesn't necessarily, it isn't necessarily warranted. And in terms of perichoresis, we've seen this idea of perichoresis come to the fore, get a loads of momentum, find a lot of sympathizers, and we've also seen that philosophical theologians have criticised perichoresis for not being able to account for ontological unity. And it's not to say it isn't a helpful concept, but it is to say we need to clarify that concept, work through it methodically, and not simply use it as a way of projecting what we want to say onto the unity of the Trinity. So a bunch of assumptions, and a bunch of assumptions that have changed over the past 30 years as a result of philosophical scholarship and historical scholarship. That's my thoughts about the development of the doctrine of the Trinity over the last 30 years as a result of my research. Presumably there's a great deal more to learn, but I think that sums up the details. Of further interest for me as I research will be, again, reading these primary texts, reading things like Moltmann's Trinity and the Kingdom, reading Lacugna, God for Us, and then seeing where that takes us. So there we go. That's the end of this update.